In the quiet hills of Montana, a former U.S. Marine named Ethan Cole uncovers a hidden tunnel beneath his late father's barn, and with it a secret buried since the Cold War. What he finds changes everything he thought he knew about his family, loyalty, and truth. Stay until the end, because this story isn't just about uncovering the past, it's about redemption. If you love true-to-life mysteries and emotional storytelling like this video, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. The wind that crossed the plains of northern Wyoming came like an old voice that never learned to stop speaking. It whistled through the fence posts and the empty stables, carrying dust and cold and the faint scent of rain that never quite arrived. Ethan Cole stood on the porch of the Stillwater Ranch, the land his father had left him, and watched the light fade beyond the cottonwoods. He had been home for 3 months, and it still didn't feel like home. Maybe it never would. The war had ended for most men 8 years ago, but for Ethan, it lived on in his chest, pulsing behind his ribs every time a truck backfired or a door slammed too fast. He had served with the 1st Marine Division 2 tours in Fallujah 1, in Helmand. The scars on his left arm came from shrapnel. The deeper ones no surgeon could cut out. In the evenings, he would pour black coffee into a tin mug, sit on the porch steps and listen. The silence of Wyoming was supposed to heal him, but the silence here was not empty. It was waiting. The house had been untouched since his father died. The photographs on the wall were sun-faded, a younger version of his father in uniform, his mother holding a newborn that had grown into a man she barely lived to know. She had passed when Ethan was 9. His father had buried her under the big oak at the end of the pasture and never remarried. Ethan had learned early that some men built fences around their pain instead of graves. Inside the house smelled of cedar, old whiskey, and the faint metallic tang of dust that settled everywhere. Ethan slept in his father's bed, the same bed where the old man had died of a heart attack 2 winters before. Sometimes Ethan thought he could hear him still boots on the porch, the creak of a chair. PTSD made ghosts out of echoes. Each morning he worked the land in silence, fixing fences, clearing debris, oiling hinges that had rusted from years of neglect. The ranch was 500 acres of wind, loneliness, and dry grass. No one came around except the delivery truck that brought him supplies once a month. The driver always left quickly, as if afraid to linger too long in a place that seemed to belong to the dead. Ethan liked it that way. People had started to feel unpredictable to him. Animals, machines, and weather followed rules. Men didn't. He often thought the Marine Corps had taught him to survive war, but not peace. Out here there were no orders, no mission, no structure, only the sound of his own heartbeat and the memories that followed him like shadows that refused to be outrun. One evening in late October, when the sky burned copper behind the hills, Ethan went out to the barn to repair the western wall. The boards had warped under snow and time. He wore his old camis, faded desert pattern sleeves rolled up, and the weight of the uniform made him feel briefly anchored. He turned on the work light, its hum filling the quiet. As he hammered a nail into the frame, the sound echoed strangely. He paused. The floor beneath him gave a dull, hollow thud, not the solid knock of packed earth and oak planks he expected. He shifted his weight and felt the faintest vibration underfoot, as if something hollowed out the ground beneath. He crouched, pressing a calloused palm against the wood. The vibration came again, steady, faint, almost rhythmic. At first he thought there was the wind rattling loose beams, but this was different. It was deliberate. He tapped the board twice with the hammer. Silence. Then from below, 3 slow knocks answered. Ethan froze. His breath came shallow, his pulse quickening with that old battlefield alertness, the one that never truly left Marines even years after deployment. His mind flicked through possibilities, old piping an animal a prank. But no one was within miles. The ranch stretched so far that even the nearest road could barely be seen on clear days. He removed the work gloves, ran his fingers along the seams between the planks. Dust filled the air, glowing in the shaft of light, like drifting ash. Then it came again. Clang, clang, clang. Like metal striking metal from beneath his boots, Ethan straightened, slowly scanning the shadows of the barn. His chest tightened. The last time he'd heard that kind of hollow echo, he'd been in a collapsed bunker in Helmand, shouting for a trapped squadmate who never answered back. For a long moment, the memory flooded him so completely that he tasted the grit of sand and diesel on his tongue. "It's just the wind," he muttered. But his voice sounded false even to himself. He took a breath, forced calm into his shaking hands, and kneeled again. The sound had stopped, but the hollow echo beneath remained. He pulled his flashlight from the toolbox and shone it across the floorboards. There, between two warped planks, was a seam too clean, like the edge of a trapdoor. He reached for the crowbar. The metal was cold against his palm, slick with old grease. The first board groaned, splintering at the nails. He pried it up, exposing a square of darkness so deep it seemed to swallow the light. The air that rose was cool, damp, touched with the scent of iron and age. Beneath the floor lay a narrow stairwell, descending into blackness. Wooden steps disappeared after 6 feet, swallowed by shadow. Ethan aimed his flashlight downward and saw dust motes swirling in the beam, disturbed by a faint current of air rising from below. His breath caught. There should have been nothing there. The ranch foundation was supposed to be solid stone. He'd lived here as a boy, had crawled through every corner, and never seen a hint of any cellar or tunnel. Yet this opening looked deliberate. The light trembled in his hand as he whispered, "What the hell are you?" Outside. The wind shifted, slamming the barn door against the wall with a sudden bang that made him flinch and raise the crowbar instinctively. His marine reflexes, drilled from years of patrol ambushes, fired before thought could intervene. His heart pounded hard enough to blur his vision. He took another breath, forcing his hand to steady. The crowbar slipped from his grasp and clattered onto the wooden floor, the sound echoing into the opening like a call unanswered. He stood over the dark stairwell, unable to shake the feeling that something down there had been waiting not for anyone but for him. Ethan stood at the edge of the opening, the beam of his flashlight trembling slightly as it cut through the darkness below. The air rising from the hole smelled of metal and earth, with a faint trace of something older, like damp stone, that had not felt sunlight for decades. His instincts told him to walk away, to seal the floorboards back up and forget it. But something in the quiet insisted otherwise. Curiosity, or perhaps duty, pulled at him the way orders once did. He took a slow breath, adjusted the light, and began his descent. The first step groaned beneath his boot, then the seconds. The wood was worn but sturdy, covered in a thin layer of gray dust that shifted beneath his soles. The walls of the shaft were lined with hand-laid bricks, darkened by time and moisture. Some had crumbled, revealing bones of blackened timber supporting the structure. This was no makeshift cellar. It had been built with precision, with intention. The deeper he went, the more he felt the temperature drop, the cold pressing against his skin, like a reminder that this place had waited too long to be found. At the base of the stairs, the narrow passage stretched forward into a tunnel framed with ancient beams. The flashlight revealed faint carvings on the walls. Initials, numbers, something that looked like coordinates scratched by a knife or nail. The tunnel extended farther than he expected, disappearing into the kind of darkness that seemed to have weight. He moved carefully, the sound of his breathing amplified in the enclosed space. Each footstep echoed, bouncing back to him in uneven rhythm. Dust floated in the air, like slow-moving ghosts disturbed by his intrusion. Then the beam of light caught the edge of something metallic. He crouched. A rusted helmet lay half buried in the dirt, its surface mottled with corrosion, but still recognizable as an old U.S. Army M1 helmet. Beside it lay a small leather notebook, the edges curled and brittle with age. He reached for it, hesitating for a heartbeat before opening the fragile cover. The handwriting inside was neat, deliberate, the ink faded but legible. The first line read, "Property of Captain William Cole, 1944. Ethan's hand froze. Cole. His own last name. His grandfather's name had been William, But according to family stories, the man had died before Ethan's father was even born, lost in an accident during a military exercise. Yet here was his handwriting buried beneath the family barn in a tunnel no one had ever spoken of. He turned the pages carefully. The entries spoke of construction, secrecy, and fear. Stillwater Project primary site secured. Civilian access restricted. Tunnels reinforced. Containment priority. The notes shifted from military precision to something more personal. They said it was for safety, but we all know what that means. Orders from above, no questions asked. The rest of the page had been smeared, as though someone had dragged a wet thumb across it. Ethan closed the notebook slowly, his mind racing. He swept the flashlight around again, and the beam fell on more objects. A rusted canteen, a tattered field jacket folded neatly against the wall, a small wooden crate with a red cross painted on its side. He opened it and found glass vials wrapped in gauze labels faded beyond reading. Their contents turned to dark residue. A chill ran through him, not from the cold, but from the sense that he was standing in a forgotten chapter of his own bloodline. He took another step forward. His light caught something propped against the wall, a framed photograph, the glass cracked diagonally across the surface. He lifted it carefully, brushing away the dust with his sleeve. The image showed a young woman in a floral dress smiling under a summer sky, standing beside a man in uniform whose face mirrored his own in uncanny ways. The man wore a U.S. Marine insignia on his collar and the name Cole stitched above his breast pocket. Behind them stood what looked like the same barn, only newer, unweathered by time. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. He could almost hear his father's voice in the back of his mind, low and steady, warning him that some doors once opened could never be closed again. The light flickered as he turned the frame in his hand, catching something carved into the wooden border. It was a single word burned into the wood with careful precision: Stillwater. The same name as the ranch, the same name scrawled in the notebook. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. The photograph suddenly felt heavier than glass and wood should allow. He leaned against the wall for balance, trying to steady his breathing. The tunnel seemed to hum faintly now, as though the air itself had begun to remember its purpose. He looked down the corridor where the bricks grew darker, the path narrowing into shadow. A faint draft touched his face, carrying a metallic tang that reminded him of blood and rust. Something mechanical clicked faintly in the distance, steady repeating almost like a heartbeat beneath the ground. He raised the flashlight, but the beam reached only so far before being swallowed whole. "What were you hiding down here?" "Grandpa," he whispered, though his voice sounded foreign in the stale air. He slipped the photograph into his jacket pocket and tucked the notebook under his arm. Every instinct from his military training screamed at him to back out, mark the area, call for support. But there was no one to call, no team to report to, and a deeper part of him, one that had lived too long in silence, needed to know. He stepped forward again, boots crunching against the dirt. The air thickened heavy with dust and old secrets. His flashlight caught another shape up ahead, half buried in rubble, but before he could move closer, the faint clicking stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it felt unnatural. Ethan's pulse quickened. He turned his head slightly, listening. From behind him, somewhere near the base of the stairs, came a soft sound. The quiet, unmistakable scrape of wood against metal, as if the trapdoor above was slowly, deliberately closing. The sound came again, faint but certain, echoing from the far end of the tunnel. Ethan froze mid-step, the flashlight trembling slightly in his grasp. It was the same rhythm as before, 3 deliberate knocks, spaced evenly apart, as if someone were signaling through the walls. He turned toward the noise, his breath shallow, the silence between each sound pressing against his chest. The light swept over uneven bricks, a coil of rusted wire, and then the faint glint of something metallic hidden behind a collapsed support beam. The tunnel had narrowed its ceiling, dipping low enough that he had to crouch as he approached. Dust rained softly from above, with each movement carrying the smell of decay and damp wood. When he reached the end, his flashlight caught the outline of a large steel door half buried behind rubble. The surface was coated in rust, but he could still see the faint lettering etched into the metal, authorized personnel only. The edges of the door frame bore scorch marks, and along one side ran a seam of welded steel that sealed it shut. He pressed his hand against the cold surface and felt a faint vibration, steady, rhythmic, too consistent to be mere echo. Someone or something was on the other side. He leaned closer, ear nearly touching the door. The sound came again, this time weaker, followed by something that froze the air in his lungs, a voice. "Please," it whispered hoarsely. "Don't make noise, they'll hear us." Ethan staggered back, heart hammering. The voice was human, fragile, trembling with exhaustion. Every instinct from his training shouted for caution, but curiosity had already taken hold. He crouched, searching the base of the door, tracing the welds with his fingertips. Whoever had sealed this hadn't wanted it opened. The marks were professional, methodical, the kind of work done to last. Yet time had corroded the seams, and small gaps revealed patches of air movement from within. He retrieved the crowbar from his belt and wedged it into the edge. The screech of metal against metal echoed through the tunnel, sharp and piercing. He stopped immediately. "Please," the voice said again, barely audible now. "Please, not so loud." The tone carried a terror that felt practiced, as if the speaker had spent years whispering to walls. Ethan lowered his voice instinctively. "Who are you?" he called, pressing closer. Silence, then a long exhale. "Is it safe?" the voice asked. "Safe," from what Ethan replied. The pause that followed stretched so long it felt as though the air itself held its breath. Then came the answer, quiet and fragile. From them. The hairs on the back of Ethan's neck rose. He didn't know who they were, but fear like that couldn't be faked. He tightened his grip on the crowbar and began working the edge again, slower this time, careful not to make more noise than necessary. The metal gave reluctantly flakes of rust and old weld popping loose. The air from inside was stale and heavy with the odor of mildew dust, and something else, something faintly organic like sickness. When the gap widened enough to fit his fingers through, he pulled. The door groaned like an animal in pain. A sliver of light spilled into a small chamber beyond, and with it came a soft gasp from the other side. "Stop," the voice said again, weaker, now barely above a breath. "You'll bring them. There's no one here but me," Ethan said quietly. He pushed the door open another inch. The beam of his flashlight cut across the narrow room, revealing concrete walls stained dark with moisture. In the far corner sat a man wrapped in a gray blanket, his face turned away from the light. He looked impossibly thin, his frame barely more than shadow beneath the fabric. Long, tangled hair framed a face pale beneath layers of grime, and his hands shook as he raised them to shield his eyes. "It's all right," Ethan said, softening his tone. "I'm not here to hurt you." The man blinked slowly, squinting at the sudden brightness. His eyes were milky blue, the kind that had not seen daylight for years. His skin bore the grayish tone of someone who had lived too long underground. When he finally spoke, his voice rasped through cracked lips. "Who are you? My name's Ethan Cole," he replied, stepping closer but keeping his distance. "I found this place by accident." The man's expression shifted at the name, a flicker of recognition, or maybe disbelief. "Cole," he repeated. "You said Cole." "Yes," Ethan answered. "Why?" The man swallowed hard, his throat working as though the act itself pained him. "I knew your father," he said after a long moment. "I served beside him." Ethan's heart stopped. "My father was never in the service," he said quickly, though even as he spoke, the photograph in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest. The man shook his head slowly, his hair falling across his forehead. "Not officially," he whispered. "None of us were not down here." His voice trembled with the effort of speaking, as if each word had to fight its way out. Ethan stepped closer, shining the light around the small chamber. Empty cans were stacked neatly along one wall, their labels faded. A bucket half full of rainwater sat beneath a crack in the ceiling, where condensation dripped slowly, forming a steady rhythm like a ticking clock. A pile of blankets formed a makeshift bed beside a crate of old rations, most long expired. The man had been living here, surviving on scraps and rain. "How long have you been down here?" Ethan asked. The old man looked away, eyes fixed on the wall, as if afraid to answer. Long enough to forget the seasons, he said quietly. Long enough for everyone else to forget me. His hands trembled as he reached for a small tin box beside him. From it, he pulled a rusted dog tag and held it out. Ethan took it carefully, reading the worn engraving under his flashlight. John Mercer, it read, followed by a service number and the faded stamp of the U.S. Army. "You were a soldier," Ethan said. The old man gave a faint, broken smile. "We all were once," he murmured. "Until they locked us in." "Who locked you in?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Mercer's eyes darted toward the ceiling as though expecting something to listen from above. "The ones who built this place," he said. "Your father tried to stop them, but it was too late. They sealed it. He told me to stay hidden." The words hit Ethan like a wave. The air between them felt charged heavy with a truth too large to understand. The old man coughed, his body shuddering with the effort. "He said you'd come back someday," Mercer whispered. "He said you'd finish what he couldn't." Ethan knelt beside him, his mind spinning. The beam of his flashlight trembled across the floor, illuminating the dog tag in his hand. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Mercer's gaze lifted to meet his. The blue of his eyes seemed to clear for a moment, sharp and focused despite the years. "Your father wasn't who you think he was," he said softly. "And this place isn't a ranch. It's a burial ground for the truth." The sound of something shifting above them interrupted his words, faint but distinct, like footsteps crossing the floor of the barn. Mercer's eyes widened in sudden panic. "They found us," he whispered. "They always do." For a long moment, the air between them was filled with the sound of slow breathing and the soft drip of water from the ceiling. Ethan could still hear faint creaks above them, but the footsteps that had sent Mercer into panic had faded. The old man's shoulders relaxed, though his eyes stayed fixed on the tunnel entrance. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and deliberate, as if each word had to climb out of years of silence. "My name is John Mercer," he said. "I was part of Operation Stillwater, the project your father tried to bury." Ethan's grip tightened around the flashlight. The name struck a chord deep in his memory. Stillwater, the same word carved into the photograph, the same name his grandfather's notebook had carried. "My father was a rancher," he said quietly. "He wasn't part of any operation." Mercer gave a weak smile, the kind that comes from pity rather than amusement. "That's what you were told? That's what he wanted you to believe?" He coughed, his breath rattling in his chest. "We were soldiers without insignia. The Cold War wasn't fought only with guns and spies, son. There were other weapons, ones no one ever wanted to claim." Ethan's heart pounded. "Weapons," Mercer nodded slowly. "Biological. Chemical. They tested them in secret. Your father was one of the officers assigned to oversee containment here in 1983. Ethan stared at him, shaking his head. "My father was 16 in 1983. Mercer looked at him sharply, then exhaled almost a sigh. "Not your father," he said. "Your grandfather, Captain William Cole. But your father carried the guilt. He kept this place alive long after everyone else was gone, just to make sure no one found what was buried." Ethan's throat went dry. He remembered his father's hands, always rough, always trembling slightly when storms passed over the plains. The man had rarely spoken of the past, but sometimes in his sleep he had muttered names Ethan didn't recognize. He had assumed it was the echo of a war story, not a confession. "He told me he was trying to protect the family," Ethan said under his breath. "He was," Mercer replied. "But not from outsiders. From what's still down here?" He leaned back against the wall, his body frail beneath the thin blanket. "Before he died, he came to see me. He left something with me, said I should only show it to you if you ever came back." Mercer reached into the folds of the blanket and drew out a small metal box, rusted but intact, sealed with a strip of brittle tape. He said these were the letters he could never send. Mercer whispered, "He wrote them for you, but he never had the courage to deliver them." Ethan hesitated before taking the box. The metal was cold and damp, and as he peeled back the tape, a faint smell of oil and paper rose into the air. Inside were several envelopes, their edges yellowed and brittle. Each was labeled in the same handwriting he remembered from his father's old ledgers. The first envelope read, "To my son, when you're old enough to understand." His chest tightened. His father had been gone for 2 years, and yet here he was, speaking again through folded pages. Ethan sat cross-legged on the dirt floor and opened the first letter carefully, afraid it might crumble in his hands. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. Ethan, if you're reading this, it means the past has found you the same way it found me. I tried to keep Stillwater buried, but secrets like this don't stay quiet forever. The writing wavered slightly, as though the man had hesitated mid-sentence. You deserve to know what kind of man I really was. In 1983, I followed orders that cost innocent lives. We were told it was a containment drill, just another test. But it wasn't. It was a weapon test. Ethan's pulse quickened. His hands shook as he turned to the next page. They said it was non-lethal, something that would disable enemy forces without bloodshed. But something went wrong. The wind shifted. It carried the compound into a nearby village. 43 people died within hours. Families, children. I saw their faces. I remember the silence after. The next line was darker, written with more pressure. I gave the order to seal the area, to hide it, to burn everything. Ethan closed his eyes, the words searing into him. The faint smell of smoke from his memory seemed to return, blending with the damp air around him. Mercer spoke softly. He wasn't the only one who wanted to stop it. Some of us tried to expose it, but the agency shut it down. Those who spoke disappeared. The rest of us were ordered to stay underground to watch and report if there were any leaks. He gestured weakly towards the walls. I was one of the watchers. Your father, he came back years later after the Cold War ended. He couldn't live with what he'd hidden. But by then, no one wanted the truth. Ethan's mind reeled. The image of his father, quiet and withdrawn, haunted by something unseen, now made painful sense. The letters trembled in his hands. If you ever find this place, the next page read, you'll want to destroy it. Maybe you should. But remember this, the people who built Stillwater are still alive. They will come if they think the evidence survived. Mercer's voice dropped to a whisper. He was right. They never stopped watching. They made sure I stayed here out of sight, but never truly free. They feared what I knew. He coughed again, pulling a folded scrap of paper from the inside of the blanket and handing it to Ethan. Coordinates, he said. Where it began. Where they buried the rest. Ethan unfolded it, the numbers scrawled hastily across the page. Why tell me now, he asked. Mercer looked at him with eyes that were both pleading and relieved. Because you still have a chance to finish what your father started, and because they'll come for me soon, and maybe for you too. Ethan glanced toward the tunnel, the silence pressing in around them again. Who are they? He asked quietly. Mercer shook his head. The ones who think they can erase what history refuses to forget. He pointed weakly at the letters in Ethan's hand. Those words, those are your inheritance, not this land. Don't let them burn twice. Ethan looked down at the paper again, the writing of a man who had lived and died, with the weight of guilt pressed into every word. His father's confession felt both impossible and undeniable. The letters seemed to hum in his hands, as if they carried not just words, but echoes of voices that had waited decades to be heard. Somewhere above, the sound of wind returned, rattling the boards overhead. Mercer flinched at the noise, his frail hands clutching the blanket tighter. It's starting again, he whispered, his voice breaking. Ethan turned his light toward the stairwell, heart pounding. He could no longer tell if the sound was merely wind or the footsteps of the past finding its way back to the surface. Ethan could not sleep that night. The flickering light of the oil lamp cast restless shadows across the tunnel walls, each one taking the shape of something that should have stayed buried. The letters lay spread out on the dirt floor beside him, their paper edges trembling in the faint draft that swept through the underground corridor. Mercer had drifted into shallow sleep, his breathing uneven, the rattle in his chest a steady reminder that time was running out for both of them. But Ethan's thoughts refused to quiet. His father's words pulsed through his mind like a second heartbeat. They'll come if they think the evidence survived. He stood flashlight in hand and followed the narrow passage deeper into the darkness. The tunnel sloped downward, the air turning colder, heavier. His boots echoed softly against stone until he reached a sealed section of wall. The bricks here were darker, the mortar rougher. Someone had built this part later with haste, rather than care. A faint metallic scent lingered sharp and acrid like old machinery and rust. Ethan brushed the dust away, revealing the faint outline of a reinforced door. It bore no handle, only a recessed slot, and a faded stencil that read, U.S. Department of Defense, property of Stillwater Research Division. His breath caught. He gripped the edge of the door and pulled, feeling it resist, before giving way with a low groan of corroded metal. The flashlight beam fell on a chamber lined with rows of metal containers, all identical in size, each stamped with military symbols, the radiation trefoil serial numbers, and a date, 1983. Ethan knelt beside one and ran his fingers over the embossed letters. The lids were welded shut, the steel warped slightly from time and pressure. The faint smell of formaldehyde and oil filled the air, a sterile ghost of laboratories long abandoned. He pried at one corner with his knife until a brittle flake of weld gave way, releasing a hiss of air so cold it stung his throat. Inside, a glass vial rested in a padded slot, half filled with amber liquid that shimmered faintly under the light. There were hundreds of them, each labeled with cryptic codes and numbers. The realization hit him hard. These were the remnants of Stillwater, the project his father had tried to destroy. The silence in the chamber was suffocating. Every instinct told him to seal the door and walk away, but curiosity and duty, those twin poisons of every soldier, kept him rooted in place. He took one of the vials, wrapping it carefully in cloth, and carried it back toward Mercer. The old man stirred when he approached, his cloudy eyes catching the dim glow. "You found them?" Mercer whispered. Ethan nodded. "What's inside them?" Mercer's face tightened. Everything they couldn't control. The pathogen, the failure, the evidence. It wasn't supposed to survive. He coughed, struggling for air. "You need to be careful. If they know those containers are still here, they'll send someone." Ethan wanted to ask who they were, but the answer came sooner than expected. By morning, heavy clouds rolled across the plains, and a black SUV appeared at the edge of the dirt road leading to the farmhouse. Ethan watched from the porch, heart steady but ready. The vehicle bore FEMA markings, its tires crunching over the gravel. The woman who stepped out was tall, mid-30s, wearing a federal-issue field jacket and a badge clipped to her collar. Her dark hair was tied back neatly, her expression composed but alert. "Mr. Cole," she asked, extending a gloved hand. "Dr. Lara Mitchell, Federal Emergency Management Agency. We received a report about possible radiation leakage in this area. I'm here to assess the site." Ethan studied her face. She spoke with the calm authority of someone used to disaster zones, but her eyes scanned the property like a soldier's calculating, mapping, memorizing. "Radiation," he repeated. "From what source?" She offered a polite but evasive smile. There was an old containment report from the late 80s. Routine follow-up, nothing to worry about. Ethan nodded slowly, though his instincts prickled. "You'll want to see the barn first," he said, gesturing towards the structure. She followed him inside her boots, leaving shallow prints in the dust. When she saw the trap door, her composure faltered slightly. "That wasn't in the report," she murmured. "Found it by accident," Ethan said. "You might want to see what's down there." The descent was silent except for the creak of wood beneath their feet. The smell of damp earth thickened as they reached the tunnel. When Lara's flashlight beam swept across the rows of sealed containers, she froze. For a heartbeat, her professional calm vanished, replaced by something deeper, fear or perhaps recognition. "Where did you find these?" she asked, her voice lower now. "They were already here," Ethan replied. "Been sealed for decades." She stepped closer to one of the crates, tracing the faded stencil with her gloved fingers. "This symbol," she said softly, "isn't radiation. It's a biohazard mark used by the old Defense Research Division." Ethan caught the tremor in her tone. You've seen it before." She hesitated, then exhaled slowly. "My father worked for FEMA in the late 80s. He told me about Stillwater. Said it was classified as an environmental containment project. But the truth, he said it wasn't about protecting anyone. It was about hiding what the government didn't want the world to find." Her eyes lifted to his. "I didn't think any of it survived." Ethan's pulse quickened. "You knew this place existed?" Lara shook her head. "Not exactly. But there were rumors about a farm in the Midwest where something went wrong. People disappeared. Reports buried." Her flashlight trembled slightly as she examined one of the crates. "If these are intact, then the contamination reports were lies." She turned to him. "Mr. Cole, do you have any idea what this means?" He folded his arms, the Marine in him surfacing again. "I know it means someone lied for a very long time, and my family was part of it." Lara's expression softened. "You're not responsible for what they did." "Aren't I?" Ethan said quietly. "This land carries their name. The Herr Guild." She didn't answer. Instead, she opened her field bag and took out a small scanning device, running it over one of the containers. The device emitted a faint beep, then another, faster this time. "There's something active inside," she murmured. "Could be a chemical reaction, could be worse. We need to secure these immediately." And then what Ethan asked. "Then we contact Washington." She hesitated. "But if you're right, if these are what I think they are, there are people in Washington who will want them destroyed before anyone sees them." Ethan felt a cold certainty settle over him. "You're not here because of radiation," he said. "You were sent because they knew." Lara met his gaze, and for a moment the official mask fell away. "I didn't come to silence you," she said softly. "I came because someone has to make sure the truth doesn't vanish again." Her words carried conviction, but her eyes betrayed conflict loyalty, battling conscience. From deeper in the tunnel, a faint metallic sound echoed, sharp and deliberate, like something shifting in the dark. Ethan raised his light, scanning the shadows. "We're not alone down here," he whispered. Lara's hand went to her radio instinctively. Static hissed. Then a brief burst of coded chatter filled the air. She froze. "That's not my team," she said, voice tightening. Ethan stepped between her and the tunnel entrance. The echo came again, closer this time. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Somewhere beyond the crates, something or someone was moving. The air grew colder, the silence heavier. Lara switched off her light, her whisper barely audible. "They found us." Ethan's grip tightened around the flashlight, his heartbeat steadying into the rhythm of the soldier he used to be. The tunnel grew still again after the sound above faded. Lara stood near the crates, her flashlight trembling faintly in her grip. Ethan could see the tension in her jaw, the conflict behind her calm eyes. "You're not telling me everything," he said quietly. She hesitated, then nodded, lowering her gaze. "No, I'm not," she admitted, "because this isn't the first time I've been near a place like this." Ethan waited, saying nothing. She crouched beside one of the metal containers, her fingers tracing the faded military symbols. "My father's name was Dr. Stephen Mitchell," she began. "He was part of the Stillwater project. He worked for the Defense Research Division until 1984, when the project was shut down after what they called an incident." Ethan's stomach turned. "Your father worked here?" "Not here," she said softly, "but he helped design it." Her voice broke slightly. He believed it was a medical program, anti-toxin research to protect soldiers from chemical warfare. But it wasn't. It was weaponization. They were trying to create something they could release and control. She swallowed hard. And they failed. The containment broke. The gas spread through the valley. Families were living less than 10 miles from the test site. Dozens died within days. Ethan's heart sank. He had heard rumors growing up, stories of a bad year when crops died, when the wells went bad, but his father had always brushed them off. "You said the project was shut down," he murmured. "Why cover it up?" Lara looked up at him, eyes glistening. "Because our fathers made sure it was. Your father, Captain William Cole, was the field commander assigned to clean it up. Mine was the scientist in charge of decontamination. They buried everything, the samples, the records, the guilt. Ethan stepped back as if struck. You're saying they were part of the same operation? Yes, she whispered. They worked side by side. And when the truth became too dangerous, they made a pact. They sealed the site and swore never to speak of it again. Ethan's light wavered across the tunnel wall. For the first time, he saw the faint outline of painted letters beneath the dust, U.S. Biochemical Research Facility, Stillwater Unit. His breath caught. So this isn't just some bunker, it's the lab. Lara nodded. The original Stillwater lab. They built it under this property because it was remote, easy to disguise as farmland. Your grandfather's ranch was chosen for its isolation. The realization hit him like cold wind. My family's land was part of it all along, he said. We've been living on top of this. Not just living, she replied gently. Guarding. Ethan turned away, trying to steady his breathing. The walls seemed to close in the air, thick with the scent of damp metal and old chemicals. He used to come down here at night, he said faintly. I thought he was fixing equipment. He told me the noise was rats. Lara's voice softened. He wasn't fixing anything. He was making sure the truth stayed buried. She stepped closer, lowering her light. You're not responsible for what they did. Aren't I? Ethan said bitterly. This is my blood, my name, my land. Every lie they told rests here. Lara didn't argue. She knelt beside the crates, her hands shaking slightly as she brushed away dust from one of the lids. My father used to say the worst sins don't die, they just change their shape. He thought sealing this place would protect people. But the contamination didn't stop here, Ethan. It spread through groundwater, through wells and crops. Even now there are records of children in the nearby counties who were born sick. It never ended. Ethan stared at her. And you knew this when you came, I suspected, she said quietly. When I saw the FEMA assignment, I recognized the code in the report. It wasn't radiation they were worried about, it was residual toxins. I came here because I needed to know if my father's guilt was justified. Ethan's flashlight flickered over an old metal cabinet against the far wall. He pulled it open, revealing brittle folders stamped confidential and tagged with red string. Inside were pages of data photographs of experiments, names of test subjects, all labeled classified civilians. His hand trembled as he turned one of the photographs toward the light. It showed a group of families standing outside wooden houses smiling at the camera. They told them it was a vaccine trial, Lara whispered. They volunteered. Ethan set the photo down carefully, his throat tight. How could they live with this? They didn't, she said. It killed them in different ways. A long silence followed. Somewhere above the wind howled through the old barn's slats a ghostly sound that felt like the earth itself was remembering. Lara finally broke the silence. My father left me a note before he died, she said. He wrote that the last unsealed chamber held what they called the heart of Stillwater. He said if anyone ever found it, they'd know the truth of what we became. She looked around the tunnel. I think this is it. Ethan exhaled slowly. And now we're standing in it. They both turned as the old light in the corner flickered once more, casting their shadows across the wall, where faded handprints stained the concrete marks left by men long gone, who had tried to clean away what could never be washed. Lara's voice dropped to a whisper. We're not investigators, Ethan. We're the aftermath. Ethan said nothing. The words sank deep, settling in the space between grief and resolve. His father's letters, Lara's confession, the crates all pieces of a puzzle that told a story of ambition, failure, and inherited sin. From above, a faint vibration returned the sound of engines, maybe more vehicles. Dust fell from the ceiling, glittering faintly in the beam of their lights. Lara looked toward the stairwell, then back at him. If they're coming, she said, they won't let either of us leave with this knowledge. Ethan's eyes hardened. Then we'd better decide what to do with it before they get here. The night had grown thick with mist by the time the sound of engines reached the ranch. Ethan and Lara stood near the barn, their flashlights off, watching 4 black SUVs climb the dirt road. The vehicles moved in perfect formation, headlights cutting white beams through the fog. When they stopped, their engines idled with a low, synchronized hum. Men in tactical uniforms stepped out, their faces hidden behind visors, rifles slung across their chests. They spread out quickly, sweeping the area as if following a plan rehearsed long before they arrived. One man, tall and broad-shouldered, approached with an air of quiet authority. He wore no helmet, just a dark coat and leather gloves. When he spoke, his voice carried calm command. Ethan Cole. Ethan didn't move. "Who's asking?" The man pulled a badge from his coat. "Roland Hayes, National Security Division, Department of Defense. We're here under federal authority. This property is now a restricted site." Lara's eyes narrowed. "What kind of site? Hazardous containment," Hayes replied smoothly. "We've been monitoring chemical readings in the area. You're both being relocated for your safety." Ethan studied him, noting the precision in his words, the way he avoided details. "And by relocated you mean removed," he said. Hayes gave a thin smile. "You could put it that way." Behind them, a weak voice broke the tension. Roland Hayes Mercer rasped from the tunnel entrance. He leaned heavily against the wall, his face pale. Hayes turned, startled, then frowned. "Who's that John Mercer?" the old man said, his voice trembling but firm. "You have your father's eyes?" Hayes hesitated. "You knew my father?" Mercer nodded slowly. "Frank Hayes. He was there at Stillwater the night they sealed the chamber." Ethan's pulse quickened. Hayes' face remained impassive, but a shadow passed through his eyes. Mercer pointed a shaking finger toward him. "Your father killed Captain William Cole, buried him alive when he refused to carry out the final order." The words hung in the cold air like a bell tolling for the dead. Ethan felt his throat tighten. "What did you say?" Mercer's breath came shallow. "He didn't die in an accident, Ethan. They sealed him inside." Hayes straightened his tone, now colder. "That's enough. You're not well, old man." But Ethan stepped forward. "Is it true?" Hayes met his gaze unblinking. "Your father made his choice. He defied command. My father carried out his duty." Ethan clenched his fists. "His duty was murder. His duty was containment," Hayes replied evenly. "You wouldn't understand." Lara stepped closer, her voice tense. "Containment. That's what you call burning evidence and silencing witnesses." Hayes turned toward her with faint amusement. "Dr. Lara Mitchell, your father would have known better than to use words like that." Lara froze. "You knew my father?" "Of course," Hayes said. "He wrote the final decontamination report before he changed his mind. It cost him everything." She swallowed hard. "He tried to expose you." Hayes' smile faded. He tried to undo what couldn't be undone. While they spoke, Ethan's gaze shifted to the men behind Hayes. They weren't setting up detectors or equipment, they were unloading fuel drums and long metal canisters. One man unrolled black hose lines, another arranged ignition units along the barn's perimeter. The faint scent of chemical accelerant drifted on the wind. "You're not here to clean anything," Ethan said quietly. "You're here to erase it." Hayes didn't deny it. The site was contaminated beyond repair. The protocol is clear: total sterilization. "You mean fire," Ethan said. "You're going to burn it just like they did before." Hayes' voice stayed calm, almost gentle. "Sometimes you have to destroy what can't be contained." Mercer's frail voice rose behind him. "You said that 40 years ago." He staggered forward, gripping the railing. "You'll bury the truth again, but it always comes back." Hayes didn't even look at him. "Mr. Mercer, I suggest you rest. You've done enough damage already. I told your father the same thing," Mercer whispered, "and he shot me for it." The air grew heavier. Lara moved to stand beside Ethan. "If you light those charges," she said, "you'll ignite more than fire. The chemicals down there are still active. You'll poison everything for miles." Hayes turned his gaze on her, calm but unyielding. Collateral stability was calculated. "We've done this before." Ethan stepped closer. "You've been doing it for decades. How many times will you cover the same lie? As many times as it takes," Hayes said. "History doesn't need every story told." For a moment, the night fell silent. The soldiers worked with precision, setting up the final lines of fuel around the barn. The hiss of valves and the low murmur of radios filled the darkness. Ethan could see the faint glow of the accelerant reflecting in their visors. Hayes glanced toward the tunnel entrance. "Seal it," he ordered. "We'll initiate ignition once the perimeter is cleared." Two men moved toward the opening. Mercer stumbled forward, trying to stop them. but his strength failed. He fell to his knees, clutching Ethan's sleeve. "Don't let them," he gasped. "Your father died trying to save what's down there." Ethan knelt beside him. "What's down there?" Mercer's voice barely rose above a whisper. "The proof, the names, everything they fear." His eyes locked on Hayes. "He's come to finish what his father started." Hayes signaled impatiently. "Get them out of here." Two soldiers approached, reaching for Ethan's arm. Instinct took over. Ethan shoved one aside, stepping in front of Mercer and Lara. "You're not burning this place," he said, voice steady. "Not while I'm here." Hayes stopped studying him with quiet fascination. "You really don't understand who you're dealing with, do you?" "I understand enough," Ethan said. "You're afraid. That's why you're here." Hayes almost smiled. "Fear keeps order. Your father lacked it. That's why he died." Lara's radio suddenly crackled to life. Static, then a voice shouting through interference. "Unit Bravo, hold ignition. Chemical surge detected underground." The soldiers froze. Hayes snatched the radio. "Repeat!" The voice came again, distorted. "Containment breach pressure rising in lower chamber." Hayes swore under his breath, then gestured sharply. "Evacuate 2 vehicles." Now the men began to retreat, but Ethan stood still, the weight of Mercer's last words pressing on him. Behind them, the ground shuddered softly, a low vibration spreading through the earth. Lara grabbed his arm. "We have to move!" But Ethan's eyes stayed fixed on Hayes. "If this place burns," he said quietly, "so will the truth." Hayes turned once more, his expression unreadable. "Then pray it burns clean this time." The smell of gasoline spread through the cold night like a warning. Hayes shouted orders from above, his voice echoing off the barn walls as his men positioned the fuel lines. Ethan barely heard him. He was already halfway down the tunnel, flashlight clenched between his teeth, his hands reaching for the metal cases stacked in the dark. The air was thick with dust and heat vibrating faintly from the pressure building beneath the earth. Lara's footsteps followed close behind. "Ethan, we don't have time," she shouted. He didn't answer. He yanked open the nearest crate, revealing files sealed in plastic sleeves, old cassette tapes labeled with faded ink, and metal canisters stamped with the insignia of the Department of Defense. The words "Project Stillwater Restricted" glared up at him. "This is it," he muttered, stacking them into a canvas bag. "This is what they burned for." Lara crouched beside him, her face pale in the flickering beam. "We can't carry all of it." "We don't need all of it," he said. "Just enough to prove it's real." From above came the hollow clang of metal striking wood, followed by the slosh of liquid pouring down. The sharp scent of accelerant stung their noses. Hayes wasn't waiting any longer. He was burning the evidence now. Mercer stood near the stairway, his frail frame shaking. "They're sealing the entrance," he rasped. "You have maybe a minute." Ethan shoved another case into the bag. "Come with us." Mercer shook his head. "Someone has to hold the gate open. These hinges are rusted. If it closes, you won't get out." Lara grabbed his arm. "We can find another way." Mercer smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting the flashlight's glow. "I've spent half my life hiding in this hole. Let me do one thing that matters before I'm gone." Before Ethan could argue, Mercer pushed them both toward the back corridor. "Go. Your father didn't die for you to die here too." The sound of a detonator click echoed from above, sharp and final. Flames burst across the wooden beams, sending sparks raining down the tunnel. Ethan turned once, just long enough to see Mercer pull the lever that jammed the metal door open. The old man's silhouette glowed against the rising fire. "Run!" he shouted. The word dissolved in smoke. Lara grabbed Ethan's sleeve, dragging him deeper into the tunnel as the explosion roared above them. The force threw them against the wall, heat slamming through the narrow passage. Dirt and splinters rained from the ceiling. The ground shook violently, lights flickering then dying completely. Ethan's ears rang with the deafening silence that followed. When he opened his eyes, he was lying half buried under debris. His left shoulder burned with pain, blood soaking through his sleeve. Lara was beside him, coughing, covered in soot. "Ethan, can you move?" He tried to answer, but only managed a nod. She helped pull him free from the rubble, her hands trembling but steady. The tunnel behind them was collapsing, a slow groan of ancient wood giving way. "We have to get out before the air goes," she said, her voice breaking. He looked at the bag still strapped across his chest. Somehow, it had stayed intact. The files... We'll get them out, she said. Just move. They stumbled through the tunnel, guided only by the faint orange glow of the fire spreading from above. Every breath felt heavier, the air thick with smoke and chemicals. Ethan's vision blurred, pain pulsed behind his eyes. Somewhere ahead, the tunnel bent upward toward the secondary hatch that led near the east pasture. Lara climbed first, pushing against the rusted lid. It didn't budge. It's sealed, she gasped. Ethan braced beside her, muscles straining, and together they forced it open with a metallic scream. Fresh air poured in, cold and sharp. Lara climbed out first, then reached back for him. Come on. The night outside was chaos. The barn was a tower of flame columns of fire twisting into the sky. Black smoke rose like a living thing. Ethan hauled himself out, coughing, his uniform torn and streaked with blood. Behind them, a second explosion rocked the ground. Part of the roof collapsed inward, sending sparks and debris flying. John's still down there, Lara whispered, her face streaked with ash. Ethan turned towards the burning barn, but she grabbed his arm. It's too late. His throat tightened. He bought us time. Then don't waste it, she said. They staggered toward the fence line, every step an effort. The heat from the flames seared their backs. Ethan's shoulder throbbed where shrapnel had torn through muscle. His vision dimmed and he stumbled, nearly falling. Lara caught him, looping his arm over her shoulders. Stay with me, she urged. We're almost there. Behind them, the ranch, the place that had carried his family's history and its sins, was collapsing into itself. The sound of splintering beams and crackling fire filled the night like a requiem. Near the tree line, they turned back. The barn was almost gone, a pillar of red against the dark horizon. For a moment, Ethan thought he saw movement near the flames. A figure standing still amid the firelight. Mercer, or maybe just the shadow of what he'd left behind. Lara's eyes filled with tears. He knew it would end this way, she said quietly. Ethan's voice came rough and low. Maybe it's the only way the truth could survive. They reached the old truck parked near the gate. Ethan collapsed into the passenger seat, clutching the bag of evidence to his chest. Lara started the engine, her hands shaking, and drove them away from the burning ranch. In the rearview mirror, the fire consumed everything wood soil memory. The night glowed behind them, both terrifying and strangely beautiful. Ethan's head rested against the window, his eyelids heavy. We got it, he murmured. Lara glanced at him, her eyes glistening. You got us out. For a long time, neither spoke. The radio crackled faintly static, mixing with the distant roar of flames. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, while behind them the light of the fire grew smaller, but never disappeared entirely. Ethan looked down at his blood-stained hands and whispered, It's not over. Lara kept her eyes on the road, her jaw tight. No, she said softly. It's just beginning. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of light that makes the world look like it's holding its breath. Ethan woke in a motel outside Helena. His shoulder bandaged, his head aching from smoke and exhaustion. Lara sat by the window laptop, open, her fingers moving carefully across the keyboard. The sound of distant trucks rumbled through the thin walls, but she didn't look up. You should rest, she said softly. Ethan struggled to sit up. What are you doing sorting through what you carried out, she said, nodding toward the canvas bag resting on the bed. There are files, tapes, and something labeled Debriefing Archive. It's dated October 1983. He rubbed his temples, his voice hoarse. That's the year my father died. Lara clicked a folder, and a list of encrypted videos appeared. I think this one might be his last report, she said. She inserted the tape into a converted reader, and the screen flickered to life with static. Then an image appeared. A man in uniform sitting in a dimly lit bunker. The name tag, Captain W. Cole, visible on his chest. His face was younger than Ethan remembered from old photos, but the same eyes stared back, tired and haunted. The timestamp in the corner read November 3rd, 83, Project Stillwater Debriefing Room. The man's voice came through rough but steady. My name is Captain William Cole, United States Marine Corps. If anyone ever finds this recording, it means they failed to bury us completely." He paused, eyes darting off-screen as if afraid someone might hear. "We were ordered to contain a test gone wrong. The Stillwater compound wasn't chemical, it was biological. It infected the water supply beneath the test site. Dozens of civilians got sick, children. We were told it was classified contamination. They told us to burn everything and everyone." Ethan felt his stomach twist. His father's hands shook in the video. "I followed orders until I couldn't anymore." He continued. "I tried to contact the press, but command intercepted every transmission. They said I'd be court-martialed for treason. I'm leaving this record because someone has to know the truth. The project wasn't shut down, it was moved. If they come for me, they'll call it an accident." His voice broke on the last words. "I can't undo what I've done, but maybe my son will live long enough to do better." The screen went black. Lara closed the laptop slowly. The silence in the room was thick. He knew she whispered. Ethan stared at the blank screen, unable to speak. The man he'd spent his life trying to forgive had been trying to tell him the truth all along. "He died for this," Ethan said finally, "and they buried it under my feet." Lara looked at him. "Then let's dig it back up." They spent the next day cataloging everything in the bag. There were signed orders, chemical reports, DNA samples sealed in evidence tubes, even a blood-stained logbook marked with the same insignia from the tunnel. Lara cross-referenced the dates with declassified Cold War documents. Every connection led back to one name, Roland Hayes' father, General Frank Hayes, listed as project director. "We have proof," she said quietly. "Enough to start an investigation." Ethan leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "They'll come after us." Lara nodded. "Then we go first." That night, she uploaded the video to multiple servers, encrypting copies across news networks and online archives. "Once it's out, they can't pull it back," she said, pressing enter. The video of Captain Cole's confession began circulating within hours. By dawn, it had gone viral. News anchors across the country were replaying the footage, showing the haunted face of a Marine who had confessed to a hidden atrocity. Reporters traced the coordinates in the file metadata to Ethan's property, showing satellite images of the burned ranch. Words like cover-up biological testing and mass casualties flashed across screens nationwide. Within 48 hours, federal investigators arrived in Montana. Agents in dark suits combed through the ruins, pulling soil samples and charred fragments of metal crates. Lara turned over the DNA tubes to the Department of Justice, where analysis confirmed contamination consistent with classified military compounds from the 1980s. It was undeniable proof. By the end of the week, the Attorney General announced a full-scale reopening of the Stillwater inquiry. The names of those responsible, living and dead, were read aloud in a press briefing. Among them were General Frank Hayes, Dr. Alan Mitchell, and several surviving officers. Ethan watched the broadcast from a hospital bed, his arm in a sling. Lara sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. The reporter's voice trembled as she described the findings, a secret Cold War experiment, covered up through decades of false reports, with evidence destroyed and witnesses silenced. For the first time, the reporter said the government acknowledges the loss of at least 89 civilians as a result of the Stillwater tests. The camera cut to images of families holding old photographs, faces lined with grief and vindication. Ethan felt tears sting his eyes. "They finally said it," he whispered. "After 40 years, they said it." Lara squeezed his hand. "Your father would be proud." He shook his head. "He'd be ashamed it took me this long." Outside, a crowd had gathered, holding candles for the victims. Among them were veteran scientists and descendants of the families who'd lived near the old test site. Some carried signs that read, "Truth belongs to the living." Others simply stood in silence, as if listening to the voices buried too long beneath the earth. 2 days later, federal marshals arrested Roland Hayes in Washington. The charges included destruction of evidence, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Footage showed him being led from his office, expression cold and defiant, his silence heavier than denial. Lara turned off the television. "It's not over yet," she said. Ethan nodded. "No, but it's begun. He stood by the window looking out at the horizon washed in pale light. The land outside seemed quiet again, but not peaceful, more like it was waiting. He thought of Mercer's sacrifice of his father's confession, of all the buried truths clawing their way back into daylight. The past doesn't die, he murmured. It just waits for someone to listen. Lara came to stand beside him. Then let's make sure it's heard. The knock on the door came moments later, a single, deliberate sound that made them both turn. A man in a gray suit stood outside, badge gleaming under the morning sun. "Mr. Cole, Dr. Mitchell," he said. "The Senate committee would like your testimony." Ethan met Lara's eyes, the weight of everything they'd uncovered pressing between them. "Then I guess it's time," he said quietly. The autumn wind carried the scent of rain as people gathered beneath the pale Montana sky. Rows of folding chairs faced a simple wooden stage built on the ashes of what once was Ethan's family ranch. The fire had long gone out, but the ground still bore its scars, blackened soil, twisted metal fragments of the past too stubborn to disappear. Flags fluttered at half-mast, and a marble plaque glimmered in the morning light. It read, "In memory of the victims of Project Stillwater, 1983, 2025. Ethan stood among the crowd wearing his old Marine uniform. The jacket no longer fit perfectly. The fabric was tight across his shoulders, the metals dull from years of dust. A faint scar traced the left side of his face, cutting through the line of his jaw, a mark from the explosion that nearly ended his life. Yet he looked steadier now, grounded, as if the wound had finally taught him how to stand still. Lara stood a few steps away, holding a binder of notes, her expression solemn but proud. The crowd included veterans, scientists, survivors' families, and young students who had grown up hearing whispers of Stillwater in their history books. Cameras lined the perimeter, recording every word that would be spoken that day. When Ethan stepped up to the podium, the murmurs faded. His voice carried easily calm, but weighted with memory. 42 years ago, he began men wearing uniforms like mine built something they thought would make the world safer. They were wrong. They built fear, instead fear of truth, fear of exposure, fear of consequence. He looked down at the yellowed paper in his hands. My father was one of them. Before he died, he left this letter. I'd like to read it now. He unfolded the page carefully, the handwriting faded but steady. If there is anyone left to read these words, he read, his voice trembling. Please forgive the man who killed because he was afraid. We thought obedience was honor. We thought silence was loyalty. But silence becomes a weapon when truth is buried beneath it. I cannot undo what we did, but maybe you can teach the world that courage is not destroying what we fear, it's facing it. A quiet ripple passed through the crowd. Some wiped tears, others bowed their heads. Ethan lowered the letter, his eyes sweeping across the faces before him. My father wasn't a hero, he said softly, but he tried to become an honest man. And maybe that's harder. He paused, his breath catching. We stand here today not to erase what happened, but to remember why it must never happen again. Behind him, the new memorial stood modest, yet powerful, a semicircle of engraved stones bearing the names of those lost in the Stillwater contamination. Flowers rested at their base, wild daisies, and small American flags placed by families who finally had somewhere to grieve. After the ceremony, reporters surrounded him, microphones flashing. Mr. Cole, one asked, "Do you feel vindicated?" Ethan shook his head. "There's no victory in this," he replied quietly. "Only peace that came too late." He turned towards the horizon, where the rebuilt barn stood in the distance, not a barn anymore, but the first structure of what he called Stillwater House. It was a rehabilitation center for veterans struggling with trauma, funded partly by federal grants, partly by private donations from people moved by his story. The sign at the entrance was simple, carved from salvaged oak, Stillwater House, a place to begin again. Weeks later, Ethan walked through the halls of the new center. The air smelled faintly of pine and clean linen. Inside, veterans shared coffee, laughter, and sometimes silence. There were therapy rooms lined with warm light, an art studio filled with unfinished canvases, and a wide field out back, where some learned to ride horses as part of their recovery. On one wall hung 3 framed photographs, Captain William Cole in uniform. John Mercer smiling awkwardly in his youth, and a faded group photo of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder beside a handwritten caption for those who carried the truth when it was too heavy to bear. Lara joined him near the main hallway, clipboard in hand. "The first group's settling in," she said. "They've started planting trees by the East Ridge." Ethan nodded, watching sunlight spill through the windows. "Good. This land owes something back." She looked at him. "You could have left, you know. Sold the property, walked away from all this." He smiled faintly. "If I'd left, it would have just been another burned field. This way it grows again." They walked outside the grass, whispering beneath their boots. In the distance, the memorial stood quiet, framed by golden fields. The wind carried the faint echo of chimes strung along the porch, soft and rhythmic. Ethan stopped beside the gate, where the inscription had just been mounted. The metal letters caught the sun, bright and resolute. "Courage isn't killing to protect the truth. It's living to face it." He ran his fingers over the words, tracing them like a promise. Lara stood beside him, her hand brushing his arm. "Do you think they'd be proud?" she asked. He looked out across the open land, where the horizon seemed to shimmer with memory. "I think they'd finally rest." A group of veterans passed by, laughing quietly as they headed toward the stables. One carried a guitar, another pushed a wheelchair through the grass. Ethan watched them with a mixture of pride and ache. "They remind me of my platoon," he said. Lara smiled. "Then maybe you finally brought them home." As evening approached, the sky turned amber, and the last rays of sunlight spilled across the memorial stones. Ethan sat alone on the porch, watching the wind move through the tall grass. He could still smell faint traces of smoke from the land that once burned, now mingled with the scent of soil and rain. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his father's dog tags, the metal worn smooth with age. Hanging them on a nail beside the door, he whispered, "We made it right, Dad." The sound of footsteps approached softly behind him. Lara placed a steaming cup of coffee beside his chair. "You never stop working," she said gently. "Neither did he," Ethan replied. They sat in silence, listening to the rustle of the wind and the faint hum of voices from inside the house. Somewhere in the distance, a flag fluttered. As dusk settled, the field glowed with the golden light of lanterns strung along the fences. For the first time in years, the air felt still not heavy, not haunted, but whole. Ethan took a slow breath, his chest rising with quiet resolve. The ghosts of Stillwater were no longer trapped beneath the earth. They had come to rest above it in the laughter of those rebuilding their lives, in the courage of those who chose to heal. The war inside him had finally met its ceasefire. The night deepened, and the wind carried with it the mingled scents of smoke dust and grass reminders of pain and rebirth of endings that gave way to beginnings. Ethan rose, looked once more at the sign on the wall, and smiled. The words gleamed faintly in the starlight, a final truth carved in metal and memory. If this story moved, you take a moment to let me know. Subscribe for more stories like this, one tales about truth, courage, and the quiet strength of ordinary people who choose to face the past. What part of Ethan's journey stayed with you most? And where in the world are you listening or reading from tonight? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your story too.